Hey guys, tonight we begin in the shadowed heart of an ancient land where elephants snored louder than priests and the smell of incense mingled permanently with goat breath and old sandalwood dust. Picture a candlelit hallway in a palace so large it took 3 servants just to find your other sandal. The walls were covered in tapestries depicting gods, mid-argument, and ancestors who definitely exaggerated their battle experience. The stone floors never quite warmed up, no matter how many tigers someone laid across them. This is where the tale of Emperor Ashoka begins, a tale of ambition, var, regret, bureaucracy, and quite a lot of rock carving. It's a story so slow-moving at times, you could take a nap between key events and not miss a thing, which is exactly why we're telling it tonight. Now, a quick warning before we properly begin. You probably wouldn't have survived this world, not because of the assassins, though there were a few, or the scorching sun, or the alarming number of diseases disguised as blessings, but because breakfast routinely involved barley soaked in yesterday's rainwater and a sort of suspicious pickle no one could identify. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always oddly soothing to know who's drifting off across the globe, one ancient empire at a time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ashoka the Great, though he wasn't great just yet, was born into the royal Maurya dynasty sometime around 304 BCE. Now, historians do squint and quibble over the exact year, as they often do. Some say 304, others argue 302, and one particularly stubborn, goat-obsessed scroll from the north claims it was during the 4th moon, after the crow flew backward, which, needless to say, is not helpful. He was the son of Bindusara, the second Mauryan emperor, a man known for having a respectable mustache and at least 16 wives, depending on who you ask and how serious they are about counting. The Mauryan court at the time was a chaotic stew of advisors, astrologers, retired wrestlers, visiting Greek diplomats, and at least one talking parrot with strong opinions on tax policy. Young Ashoka was not the first in line for the throne. He wasn't even the 5th. In fact, depending on how many siblings you count, he may have been closer to somewhere between that one with the intense stare and, him. He grew up watching half-brothers squabble over military commands, provinces, and the last piece of honey flatbread. His early life, as far as we know, involved learning Sanskrit, stabbing practice, and the fine art of appearing useful while avoiding actual responsibilities. But Ashoka was clever, not the loud, trumpet your victories kind of clever, but the kind that watches the palace guards argue and then casually walks through the side gate with a chicken under each arm. He paid attention, listened to the old stories, and once famously bested a visiting scholar in a debate over whether elephants dream of mountains. They do, apparently, but only the short ones. By the time he was a teenager, he'd developed a reputation for being both brilliant and vaguely terrifying. Not because he was cruel, though the record does mention an incident involving a misbehaving tutor and a sack of eels, but because he had that unnerving quality of being calm in rooms where everyone else was yelling. Ministers took note. Generals avoided eye contact. The royal goat, Moti, never let him near its porridge again. Still, Ashoka wasn't the golden child. His older brothers were groomed for rule, trained in diplomacy, and routinely given gifts like ivory chariots and provinces with only mild rebellions. Ashoka, meanwhile, got assignments that were best described as character building. He was sent to supervise minor provinces, inspect granaries, and once oversee the construction of a bridge that only existed on one side of the river. And yet, with each assignment, he returned with reports written in maddeningly clear prose and policies that actually worked. One village he governed went from 5 tax revolts a month to only 1. And even that was mostly a misunderstanding involving a sacred mango and a very drunk peacock. So while Ashoka's early life wasn't flashy, it was full of the slow accumulation of power, knowledge, and patience. He watched, he learned, he waited. And in a palace where ambition often burned bright and fast like a torch dropped in a wine cellar, Ashoka moved like a shadow, soft-footed, steady, and oddly fond of staring at maps for long periods. Now, historians still argue whether Ashoka was always destined for greatness, or whether he simply outlasted everyone else by not loudly declaring how destined he was. One camp insists he was born under the right star, during an auspicious eclipse, with a birthmark shaped like a dharma wheel on his thigh. Another camp suggests he mostly benefited from having fewer bad ideas than the rest. Both camps agree on one thing. However, Ashoka never forgot a slight. He could recite who snubbed him at which feast, who called his policies unimaginative, and who left him off the guest list for the prince's naming ceremony, which, to be fair, did go on for 6 days and involved a cursed melon. And slowly, with a patience that unnerved even the palace astrologers, Ashoka began preparing for the day he would no longer be overlooked. But that's still a few scrolls away. Right now, in this slow-burning beginning, the palace remains full of candlelight and quiet scheming. The goats are asleep, the bards are tuning their lutes poorly, and Ashoka, somewhere deep in the west wing, is tracing lines across a map no one asked him to study. It would be years before those lines meant anything to anyone else. Ashoka was not the favorite, nor even the second or third choice. He was the spare cog in the royal mechanism, oiled just enough to keep from squeaking, but rarely invited to turn. His brothers, sleek in silk and smugness, paraded through the marble halls of Pataliputra like peacocks who'd memorized every mirror in the palace. They had tutors, troops, and tailored destinies. Ashoka had an itchy tunic, a chipped sword, and a personal guard who once mistook a visiting merchant for a tiger. Still, he had a mind that worked sideways. While the others memorized war chants and practiced ceremonial eyebrow arching, Ashoka took notes on how the grain was stored, how the whispers of the servants turned before a rebellion, and how ministers shuffled their feet when lying. The old Emperor Bindusara ruled with the kind of practical ruthlessness that only a man with 17 children and a chronic digestive condition could summon. His favorite son was Susima, brilliant on the battlefield, beloved by the army, and reportedly able to shoot arrows while reciting love poetry. Ashoka, by contrast, had once tried to write a love poem but got distracted halfway through by an ant crawling across the ink. So it came as no surprise when, one day, Ashoka was sent away. Now, sent away might sound like exile, and in some circles, it might have been. But officially, it was a strategic appointment to govern Ujjain, a city far enough from court that messages took weeks to arrive, and small coups could be politely ignored. Ujjain was important. Yes, nestled on the trade routes, bustling with merchant caravans and temple festivals, but it was also a hotbed of petty nobles, unpredictable weather, and a distinct lack of royal baths. Ashoka accepted the appointment with a bow so deep it practically scraped the floor, then packed his scrolls, his sword, and a satchel of what he claimed were medicinal herbs, but which definitely smelled like dried stew mix. The journey to Ujjain was long, dusty, and filled with the kind of poetic suffering that only occurs when the wheel of your chariot keeps falling off every third mile. His retinue included a scribe with nosebleeds, a cook who believed in garlic as a universal remedy, and a guard captain named Nandesh, who once defeated 3 bandits using only a ladle and his left sandal. The goat, Moti, naturally came along uninvited, but utterly unbothered. Upon arriving in Ujjain, Ashoka found a city in mild chaos. Tax records were written in at least 4 different languages, 2 of which may have been made up. The temple district had declared semi-independence over a calendrical dispute involving lunar eclipses, and half the nobles believed the other half were in league with an astrologer who predicted drought every time he ran out of wine. Ashoka rolled up his sleeves figuratively, since court robes were mostly sleeveless, and began to do what no one expected. Govern, not command. Not intimidate, not charm govern. He standardized the grain weights, hired teachers to read aloud edicts in local dialects, and offered reduced taxes in exchange for accurate census data. A move that led to a brief uptick in pet chickens being registered as household members, but that was sorted out with tact and a mild threat involving stew. He didn't ask who owed him favors. He asked who knew how many wells were dry. He didn't care which noble had the oldest sword. He wanted to know who had the cleanest accounting books. Now, historians still argue whether Ashoka's success in Ujjain was due to brilliance, good luck, or simply the fact that no one else was trying particularly hard. One faction insists he introduced radical governance techniques learned from Persian envoys. Another claims he mostly just listened more than he talked. A third, more cynical group points out that Ujjain had a particularly rainy season that year, and perhaps it was the weather that kept things stable. The goat, of course, remained unimpressed. But success, it was. Letters trickled back to Pataliputra, first as whispers, then as actual reports, then as slightly panicked dispatches from ministers wondering if perhaps they had misjudged that Ashoka fellow. Meanwhile, Ashoka remained in Ujjain, drinking terrible local beer, drafting decrees in surprisingly elegant Sanskrit, and occasionally offering unsolicited advice to spice merchants on how to pack nutmeg more efficiently. And then came the battle. Not a grand war, mind you, not yet, but a skirmish, an uprising depending on whom you ask, either a petty rebellion or a long simmering noble feud, finally boiling over like a lentil stew left too long on the fire. Ashoka didn't flinch. He mounted a response with swiftness that surprised everyone, including his own generals. He deployed troops, fortified roads, and most alarmingly, actually showed up at the battlefield in person, wearing armor that looked suspiciously borrowed, and giving a speech that involved a metaphor about stubborn cows and honest tax policy. The battle was bloody and brief. When it ended, Ashoka stood victorious. The rebel nobles were defeated. The city was intact, and his legend, for the first time, began to grow. Now, here's where the scrolls get a bit theatrical. Some say he fought like a lion possessed. Others say he stayed in the tent and let his captains handle it, then posed nicely for the victory mural. One obscure account insists he was wounded and treated by a wise woman who spoke only in riddles. None of these versions mention the goat, though a half-faded carving near the temple stairs does appear to show a small, horned figure nibbling a fallen banner. Regardless of the details, Ashoka returned from battle not as a distant royal functionary, but as something more. The people cheered. The merchants offered gifts. One poet composed a song that rhymed Ashoka with okra, which didn't entirely work but was appreciated nonetheless. More importantly, news traveled. And back in Pataliputra, Susima's jaw began to tighten, because while Ashoka may not have been in line for the throne, he was no longer out of sight. The thing about royal courts, any royal court, but especially one is stuffed with cousins, parrots, and veiled threats, as Pataliputra, is that they're not built for good news that doesn't include you. So when word of Ashoka's triumph in Ujjain trickled back to the capital, the reactions were less hurrah and more oh dear. Sushima, the heir apparent, was not a fan of sharing the spotlight. He had spent years cultivating the look of a benevolent, prince-fine silks, artfully arranged prayer beads, and an entourage that included a flute player who could cry on command. He had never fought in Ujjain. He had certainly never cleaned up after an uprising, but he had excellent handwriting and the kind of smile that terrified tax collectors. And now, much to his chagrin, people were starting to whisper Ashoka instead of Susima. Bindusara, the emperor himself, was getting old, not crumbling into mush old. But certainly please stop asking him to stand during ceremonies. Oh, he had been a firm ruler, ruthless when needed, generous when convenient. But age had softened his grip on things. Ministers made more decisions. Astrologers made more mistakes. And nobody seemed entirely sure where the royal goat had wandered off to this time. It was during this fog of uncertainty that another opportunity, or perhaps a test, was handed to Ashoka. Tax protests had flared up in a nearby region known for three things: sour wine, aggressive flute duels, and a noble family that changed allegiances more often than they changed tunics. The governor there had fled, citing an allergy to pitchforks, and Bindusara, weary and mildly flatulent, dispatched Ashoka to handle it. Ashoka didn't hesitate. He left Ujjain with a few hundred troops, 2 scribes, a cook who now specialized in lentil diplomacy, and, of course, the goat, who had begun to develop a taste for official documents. When Ashoka arrived, he did not burn villages. He did not swing swords. Instead, he summoned the noble families and simply listened. He invited the farmers to speak, recorded their grievances, and made a show of adjusting the tax rate by half a fig and a handful of barley per person, which, while meaningless on paper, felt symbolic enough that riots were postponed. He then visited the temples, offered a series of prayers that were just vague enough to apply to any god paying attention, and had the roads repaired before the rains came. The rebellion melted into a mildly uncomfortable poetry competition, and within weeks, peace returned. Boring, dusty, tax-paying peace. Historians still argue over this episode. Was it cunning diplomacy? Quiet intimidation? The result of a secret meeting with a merchant syndicate that promised support in exchange for being allowed to sell sandalwood at ridiculous prices? No one agrees. What is known is that Ashoka returned with no blood spilled, a signed treaty, and an entire village choir that had composed a ballad about his fairness and his eyebrows. Oddly enough, by now, the palace could no longer ignore him. When Ashoka returned to Pataliputra, it was under the pretense of consultation. But everyone knew the truth. He was being sized up. The corridors buzzed. The court musicians tried composing subtly ominous background music. Susima doubled his public charity efforts and commissioned 3 new statues of himself, each slightly taller than the last. Ashoka kept quiet. He wore simple robes. He spoke softly. He visited the stables and complimented the horses. He made jokes that sounded like parables, and parables that sounded like jokes. And quietly, he began gathering supporters. The ministers who disliked Susima's arrogance, the generals who respected Ashoka's decisiveness, the merchants who appreciated how their caravans weren't robbed when Ashoka was in charge, even the palace servants, who noticed that Ashoka asked for water with please and thank you, unlike certain heirs who preferred yelling and bell ringing. The real turning point came not with swords, But with stew, there was a feast, as there often was. And during this feast, a noble made a toast, implying that Ashoka's success was due more to lucky reign than real leadership. Ashoka smiled. He stood, and instead of protesting or throwing wine, which was expected, he told a story. It was about a farmer, a stubborn cow, and a pot that cracked only when filled with lies. It made no sense, but by the end, everyone was laughing, except the noble, who looked deeply insulted and entirely unsure why. And somewhere in the corner, the goat belched quietly into a silk cushion. That was when people began to whisper not Ashoka or Susima, but the next one. And then, like stew left out too long, things started to curdle. Bindusara grew ill, some say poison, some say age. One scroll blames a cursed necklace sent by a disgruntled potter. Regardless, the emperor began to fade, and with him, the walls of diplomacy began to tremble. Susima moved quickly. He sought to secure the throne, rallied the court astrologers to pronounce auspicious signs, and reportedly ordered 24 ivory thrones, just to be sure. Ashoka was banned from court. Yes, just like that. Out. The official reason was health of the emperor. But everyone knew better. Ashoka was too popular, too capable, too unsettling in his calm. He was sent to Taxila, a far province known for unrest, philosophical debate, and surprisingly good tea. The city, of course, was in rebellion when he arrived, and Ashoka, instead of panicking or pouting, stepped down from his chariot, surveyed the smoke, and reportedly said, "Well, at least it's not raining." What followed was not a grand campaign, but a slow, methodical series of negotiations, arrests, reconciliations, and bribes that left the city peaceful. If mildly suspicious, he recruited philosophers as tax officials as teachers, and teachers as spies. The goat, meanwhile, took up a personal rivalry with a local camel. By the time word of Ashoka's success reached Pataliputra, Bindusara was dead. And now, everything was fire. The moment Bindusara died, though officially, the court insisted on calling it entered celestial silence. Pataliputra ignited, not in flames, but in paperwork, paranoia, and pointed banquets. Susima declared himself emperor before the body had even cooled. He donned the ceremonial robes with all the grace of a man trying to impress both his ancestors and his hairdresser at once. Trumpets were sounded, elephants were paraded, and the city's scribes were instructed to revise history slightly so that Susima had always been fated for the throne, preferably by divine lotus blossom. Ashoka, still in Taxila, heard the news and didn't blink. Instead, he called for his camel-rivaling goat, who had just eaten half a leather sandal, and began drafting letters to ministers, to generals, to temple elders, to the merchant guilds. Each note was short, politely worded, and carried by messengers who were instructed to smile like they knew a secret. And then, curiously, the empire paused. Historians still can't quite agree on what happened during this moment. Some say a civil war broke out immediately. Others insist there was a tense political standoff marked by only minor assassinations. A particularly dramatic scroll claims that Ashoka challenged Susima to a contest of riddles judged by holy monks and 2 exceptionally wise parrots. Sadly, the parrots were eaten before a winner could be declared. What is clear is that Ashoka did not wait long to return to Pataliputra. When he arrived, the streets were tense, lined with guards loyal to either one brother or the other. Priests muttered omens into their tea. Peasants placed bets. Somewhere, the bard who always returned tuned his lyre ominously. And then, things got very quiet and very sharp. You see, while Ashoka was fond of kindness, he was not allergic to force, especially when history was watching. Susima, ever confident, reportedly arranged a feast to graciously accept Ashoka's surrender. He expected Ashoka to kneel, swear fealty, and possibly cry a little. What he got instead was a blade, a betrayal, and, depending on the version you believe, a very sarcastic goat bleeding during the scuffle. Some sources say Susima was killed outright, thrown into a pit of hot coals. Others say he was exiled and later poisoned by his own men. A poetic but likely fictional account claims he tripped over a ceremonial cushion while giving a speech and was eaten by an unusually large snake. Regardless, by the end of the week, Ashoka was emperor. He did not celebrate, no grand parade, no extravagant rituals. He simply sat upon the throne, looked out over a court that had very suddenly remembered how to be quiet, and said, "Let's begin." But of course, the throne came with baggage. Brothers, several of them, remained alive. If increasingly uncomfortable, rivals muttered. The goat, now more symbolic than livestock, was granted a place near the royal dais and a cushion embroidered with suspicious bite marks. Ashoka moved fast. He ordered purges, not the bloody sort that make historians recoil, but the kind that made everyone who opposed him mysteriously retire. Provinces realigned. Governors pledged loyalty with trembling smiles. Even the merchants, normally as neutral as old stew, began offering discounts on Ashokan-era loyalty bundles. Still, the early days of his reign were not gentle. Ashoka, now wielding both authority and memory, began to rule with precision. His justice was swift. His taxation was organized. His roads, gods help him, were surveyed weekly. He restored order, crushed banditry, and demanded competence. He once reportedly demoted a high priest for confusing two types of incense during a festival, a story still whispered by temple apprentices when cleaning storage rooms. And yet, something lingered. Maybe it was the memory of Ujjain, or Taxila, or that moment in the court when everyone looked at him not as a leader, but as the last one standing. Whatever it was, Ashoka governed like a man holding his breath. He established a spy network so thorough that even the palace cats were suspected of being informants. One certainly spent a suspicious amount of time near the treasury. He held court not with grand proclamations, but with tired eyes and an increasingly philosophical tendency to pause mid-sentence and ask, "But what does peace taste like?" People weren't sure whether to answer or offer him soup. Now, here's where the scrolls differ wildly. Some describe Ashoka's early rule as tyrannical. They call him Chandashoka Ashoka the Cruel. They say he built prisons with mirrored walls so criminals could reflect on their sins, that he executed minor offenders for stealing rice or interrupting his naps, that he once ordered a minister to apologize to a fig tree for speaking ill of its bark. Others paint a more calculated picture, a ruler hard on crime, precise with justice, intolerant of corruption, but not without mercy, a man forged by palace politics and sharpened by near exile, a king who knew the price of peace, was first clearing away all the noise. Both may be true. After all, Ashoka had become emperor not through divine favor, not through prophecy, not even through inheritance, but through survival. And survival, in ancient India's tangled courts and battlegrounds, left marks deeper than any crown. But just as the empire settled, just as ministers began breathing again and tax collectors started whistling while working, something happened. A small province to the southeast, Kalinga, Kalinga, stubborn, independent, proud, and most annoyingly, refusing to be absorbed peacefully. Ashoka's advisors counseled patience. His generals, however, polished their swords, and Ashoka, one evening, reportedly stared at a bowl of lentils for so long that his cook asked if they'd offended him. He said nothing, because while the empire whispered of expansion and glory, Ashoka was already planning the war that would break him. The Kalinga campaign did not begin with a roar, but with a shrug, the kind of resigned motion a ruler makes when his patience finally wrinkles and his generals stop pretending they don't miss the thrill of organized mayhem. Kalinga, nestled stubbornly along the eastern coast of the Indian subcontinent, had refused assimilation into the Mauryan Empire like a cat refusing a bath, claws extended, fur puffed, and absolutely no intention of going quietly. It wasn't a particularly vast territory, but it had trade routes, pride, and just enough military competence to be irritating. Ashoka, who had once governed unruly provinces by charm and steady ledgers, tried diplomacy first. Envoys were sent with gifts, fine cloth, sweetmeats, philosophical texts with suggestive bookmarks. They were returned with polite refusals, thinly veiled insults, and one memo allegedly written in fishbones. So, naturally, out came the drums of war. The Mauryan army mobilized with the creaking enthusiasm of a machine too familiar with itself. There were war elephants in ceremonial armor, most of whom hated the armor, cavalry units with new stirrups that no one had tested properly, and infantry forces who'd been promised bonus rice for every rebel they politely overwhelmed. The royal scribes marched alongside them, ready to record glory or at least invent some, if glory proved inconveniently absent. Ashoka, despite now having a cushioned throne and several back problems, chose to command personally. He donned his armor still slightly too wide at the shoulders and reviewed troop formations with the grim focus of a man reviewing a stew recipe that had once killed a relative. The goat did not accompany him this time, for reasons unknown, though some say it had grown too politically influential and was now advising a minor temple council. The Battle of Kalinga began in bursts sharp, ugly bursts of blood and chaos under a sun that didn't particularly care who ruled what. The Kalingan warriors were fierce. They fought like people who'd been planning this for generations, because they knew the terrain, the tides, the secret forest trails that hadn't been marked on the Mauryan maps, because someone had eaten the corner of the scroll, possibly the goat. Mauryan soldiers fell. So did Kalingans. Entire villages were burned, rebuilt, and burned again in the confusion. Supply lines tangled like bad poetry. And Ashoka, standing atop a dusty hill, watched it all. Now here's the thing. War wasn't new to Ashoka. He had ordered executions. He had quelled rebellions. But this was slaughter. Not elegant, not strategic. Just thousands of bodies piling under the indifferent sky. Historians still argue about the death toll. Some say 100. 0 perished. Others scoff and cite exaggerated poetic weeping. A third camp, perhaps the most accurate, simply sighs and says, too many. What is not debated is Ashoka's reaction when the dust cleared and the enemy surrendered. When the flags were raised and the victory proclaimed, Ashoka did not smile. He did not feast. He did not even sit. He wandered the battlefield, staring at the corpses, soldiers, women, children, burnt wagons, shattered shrines, and then he reportedly sat beside a broken statue of a local deity and wept. One surviving scroll, preserved in what was once a monastery's cookbook, claims Ashoka didn't speak for 3 days. Another account says he asked his ministers in a whisper, "Is this what kings are for?" And somewhere in the fading heat of the battlefield, something shifted. Now, Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism is one of those historical moments soaked in significance and speculative ink. Some say it happened right there, amid the ashes. Others say it came later, during a sleepless night spent listening to a monk chant verses about impermanence, while the goat gnawed thoughtfully on a sandal. Regardless, something cracked open, and into that crack crept remorse, curiosity, and perhaps the realization that conquest had left him with more land. Yes, but less soul. He returned to Pataliputra a changed man. The war was over. The empire was intact, perhaps even stronger, but Ashoka was not. His face now bore the lines of someone who had seen too much and eaten too little. He walked slower, laughed softer, spoke to animals with an eerie level of sincerity. One court servant claimed he saw the emperor bow to a squirrel and apologize for stepping near its tail. Naturally, the ministers were alarmed. Ashoka stopped commissioning victory statues and started asking about hospital construction. He halted certain taxes and began distributing pamphlets about kindness which no one quite knew how to interpret. He invited monks to dine at the palace and requested readings from Buddhist texts instead of military reports. The royal chefs were furious. One day, Ashoka declared he would no longer eat meat. The kitchen staff, trained in 47 forms of goat curry, collectively fainted. The goat, now a symbol of peace, nodded solemnly and resumed chewing the corner of a weathered banner. Now, let's be clear, Ashoka didn't become a saint overnight. He still ruled an empire. He still enforced law and sometimes did so with the weary firmness of a man who'd seen what chaos looked like and preferred it. Neatly organized into census districts. But his priorities changed. He began erecting pillars, not the decorative kind, but giant stone ones, engraved with edicts about morality, nonviolence, and religious tolerance. They were placed all over the empire on hilltops, beside roads, near cities, even in places where the local population couldn't read the script but liked sitting in the shade they provided. Historians still debate whether this was propaganda, penance, or sincere belief. Likely it was all three. Ashoka was a man of contradictions, general and monk, emperor and servant, builder and regretter of ruins. The war with Kalinga became the line in the sand before and after. And though the empire marched on, Ashoka's footsteps were slower now, echoing not with the drumbeat of conquest, but with the soft shuffle of someone trying to tread lightly on a world he'd once tried to dominate. Back in the capital, whispers about Ashoka's transformation spread faster than wine at a bored noble's luncheon. 1 week, he was still the war-hardened emperor who'd crushed Kalinga. The next, he was hosting monks in the palace gardens, discussing the noble eightfold path while barefoot and feeding rice to a parrot named Silence. Naturally, the court was baffled. Some thought he'd been cursed. Others blamed head trauma. A few believed it was simply indigestion from too much lentil stew. But as weeks turned to months, one thing became undeniable. Ashoka had changed, profoundly, and the empire would have to change with him, or at least pretend convincingly. Ashoka's newfound devotion to Buddhism wasn't just a private matter of incense and softly whispered regrets. It became policy, sweeping, pillar-carved, elephant-approved policy. He ordered the building of monasteries, dozens of them, then schools, then hospitals, not just for humans, but also for animals, which led to the peculiar sight of a royal vet applying a poultice to a limping mongoose while chanting a Buddhist hymn. Somewhere in the corner, the goat looked vaguely jealous. He banned animal sacrifices, which caused no small amount of scandal at the temple of the goddess very fond of goats. He then reduced hunting, instructed cooks to explore vegetarian menus, and once scolded a visiting noble for wearing a fur hat during such an obviously rebirth-heavy moon cycle. But it wasn't just about bans and buildings. Ashoka wanted his people not just the elite or the priests or the ones who could afford scrolls to understand Dharma, not in the abstract sense, but as a daily practice. Be kind, tell the truth, respect your elders, unless they're wrong, in which case argue respectfully and then bring tea. And so came the edicts. These were not small notices posted at crossroads. No, Ashoka had them carved into rocks and pillars, massive, immovable things, hewn from stubborn stone and placed in public spaces from the Himalayas to Sri Lanka. The messages were simple. Do good, don't kill, avoid needless ceremonies, and be nice to your neighbors. Even if their chickens wander onto your porch and look judgmental, the messages were in Prakrit, not Sanskrit, the everyday language of the people. This alone was revolutionary. Imagine a modern ruler tweeting only in dialects spoken by shepherds and shopkeepers. That was Ashoka, emperor of both high ideas and muddy sandals. Historians still debate the sincerity of these edicts. Were they a clever way to pacify an exhausted empire, a bid for spiritual legitimacy? Or were they simply the heartfelt output of a man who had seen too much death and wanted, for once, to be remembered for something softer? One particularly skeptical historian from the 19th century insisted Ashoka was simply bored and had discovered stone carving as a hobby. This view is not widely supported, especially since Ashoka clearly did not carve them himself, but did ensure they were spread wide far beyond the capital, into forests, hillsides, even remote trading outposts where monkeys reportedly gathered to read them in silence. But Dharma wasn't all Ashoka preached. He also reformed governance. He created the role of Dharma Mahamantra's officials, tasked with spreading moral guidance across the land. These were not tax collectors or soldiers. They were bureaucrats with unusually high self-esteem and pamphlets about compassion. They traveled from village to village, asking awkward questions like, "Have you been kind to your neighbors this quarter, and do you feel your soul is adequately balanced today?" Reports suggest that while some villagers appreciated the concern, others simply nodded while quietly herding their goats out of view. The court, of course, tried to keep up. Ministers replaced their ceremonial daggers with writing quills dipped in sandalwood ink. Generals were asked to study Buddhist philosophy in between war drills. One particularly confused tax officer renamed his ledger the Book of Noble Incomes and offered tax breaks to anyone who refrained from arguing during census season. And Ashoka began writing letters. He wrote to kings in faraway lands, Egypt, Macedonia, Syria, urging them to consider Dharma. Not in a preachy way, though, it was just a bit, but with the weary warmth of someone who'd really liked the world to stop catching fire every few years. Did these kings reply? Maybe. Did they also wonder who this sandal-wearing emperor was and why he thought peace could be mailed across continents? Probably. What's undeniable is that Ashoka became one of the first rulers in history to treat moral well-being as a matter of state, not just law and order, not just roads and coins, but kindness, reflection, self-restraint. He wanted people to live better, not just longer. He even declared that parents should ensure their children study moral tales and the public holidays be used for quiet reflection, or at least for not yelling too much. Now, here's where things take a mildly absurd turn. Ashoka, at some point, decided that trees were underappreciated and overstepped. He ordered banyan and neem trees to be planted along highways for shade and symbolism. Wells were dug every half yojana, resting benches were installed, and water bearers hired to keep travelers hydrated, whether they were merchants or wandering philosophers or that one man who claimed to be searching for the perfect mango since childhood. Everywhere Ashoka's reach extended, so too did these little touches. Cool shade, clean water, gentle instructions etched in stone, and an increasing sense that this vast empire was trying, really trying, to be kinder than history required. And yet, not everyone was thrilled. Some thought the emperor had grown soft, that his Dharma obsession would weaken the military. embolden dissenters, and turn war-hardened provinces into sleepy villages full of monks and underemployed swordsmiths. Whispers returned, eyes narrowed. A few distant governors even started hoarding weapons again, just in case. Ashoka knew he wasn't naive. He hadn't forgotten how power works. He simply hoped that if he carved enough words into stone, enough shade into paths, enough intention into laws, then maybe the restlessness would quiet itself. Maybe the empire didn't need to fear its neighbors if it could simply outlast them with peace, patience, and just enough pillars. By now, the Mauryan Empire had settled into an odd, comfortable rhythm like a massive elephant that had once charged, but now mostly napped under shade trees. Covered in law scrolls and moral edicts, the roads were smoother, the wells deeper, and even the roadside inns had begun offering vegetarian stew alongside the traditional mystery meat. Nobody missed the mystery. Ashoka, now deep into his reign, had become a figure both feared and oddly beloved. Peasants referred to him as Grandfather Dharma, despite the fact that he wasn't quite old enough to be anyone's grandfather, except possibly the goats. Ministers debated his policies behind closed doors, but recited his edicts with great enthusiasm in public squares. Even the royal jesters had shifted from jokes about taxation to humorous reflections on the nature of impermanence. And yet, family remained complicated. Ashoka, despite his spiritual awakening, had children, several of them, some from earlier days, before enlightenment had replaced entertainment. Others were born after his conversion, raised in a palace where bedtime stories included tales of renunciation and sharing rice with your enemies. Most famously, he had a son named Mahinda and a daughter named Sanghamita. These two, despite being raised in the most gilded of palaces, were said to have taken to Buddhism not out of duty, but from genuine interest. Mahinda, in particular, was the kind of teenager who read sutras for fun and corrected monks on minor doctrinal points with alarming confidence. Ashoka, recognizing the spark in both, eventually entrusted them with a mission so ambitious it required not just approval from his ministers, but also several cartloads of mangoes and at least one boat that didn't immediately leak. He was sending them south to Lanka now. Sri Lanka, then known as Lanka, was a distant, ocean-flanked kingdom full of palm trees, elephants, and rulers who were generally suspicious of anyone carrying scrolls. But Ashoka had a vision, the spread of Dharma, not just through conquest, but through conversation, through saffron robes, calm voices, and the occasional well-timed parable. So Mahinda, along with a group of scholarly monks and probably more sandals than strictly necessary, sailed to Lanka, and, according to nearly all records, he succeeded spectacularly. He converted the king, the court, and eventually large portions of the island's population. He taught, debated, translated, and occasionally stared into the jungle, looking very wise. Sanghamita, not to be outdone, also made the journey carrying with her a sapling from the Bodhi tree, under which the Buddha was said to have attained enlightenment. That sapling, according to legend, still grows in Sri Lanka today, which is more than can be said for most diplomatic gifts from the 3rd century BCE. This success thrilled Ashoka. Of course, he wept, publicly, quietly, into a ceremonial bowl of coconut broth, and he declared that the spread of Dharma was now not only a domestic priority, but a foreign one too. Diplomatic envoys were sent farther afield to regions we now know as Syria, Egypt, Macedonia, and even parts of Southeast Asia. Some returned with new languages, others with mysterious vegetables, and one came back with a monkey who had allegedly been ordained. That last bit was never confirmed, But the monkey was given a title and retired near the Western Gardens. Historians remain deeply divided on how far Ashoka's religious diplomacy truly reached. Some claim these missions planted the seeds of Buddhist thought far beyond the subcontinent. Others argue that while the effort was sincere, the actual results were modest and occasionally involved more fruit baskets than conversions. One particularly skeptical scholar suggested that most rulers accepted Ashoka's messages politely, then handed them to their court scribes and said, "Make this into a poem or something," which is probably how one of Ashoka's most earnest letters ended up translated into a love ballad involving a fish, a pearl, and a suspiciously wise elephant. Back home, the reaction to Ashoka's growing focus on Dharma diplomacy was mixed. Some officials embraced it wholeheartedly, especially those who had always preferred parables to policies. Others grumbled that the army hadn't been given a new reason to march in over a decade. Sword factories closed. Armor polishers took up gardening. The Royal Department of Glorious Triumphs was quietly renamed the Bureau of Peaceful Outcomes. And yet, even those who disagreed with Ashoka's methods couldn't argue with the results. Trade flourished, banditry declined. Festivals grew more inclusive. One village near the northern border reportedly held a day of quiet disagreement, where everyone argued gently while sitting cross-legged and drinking lukewarm tea. There were no arrests, only mild sighs. Still, not all was tranquil. Ashoka's court, like all courts, had its schemers. Jealousy bubbled. Relatives jostled for favor. And while Ashoka had softened, he was not oblivious. He had once overseen the brutal unification of an empire. He knew how easily peace could crack. So he ruled with a quiet firmness like a monk who still remembered how to hold a sword. But perhaps the strangest turn of all came during the year the goat. Yes, the same one, though nobody knew how it had lived this long, refused to enter the Hall of Dharma during a ceremony. Instead, it stood outside, staring into the middle distance as if remembering a time when things were louder, bloodier, and somehow simpler. A few monks took this as a sign of impending spiritual upheaval. Others believed the goat had simply grown cynical. Ashoka, when informed, reportedly laughed for the first time in weeks and ordered a new cushion made from hemp and humility. And so the empire rolled on. Ashoka continued to plant trees, dig wells, and send messages to kings who might or might not exist. His children preached. His ministers compromised. His people, for the most part, went about their days under a regime that was less interested in controlling their lives than gently reminding them to be a bit nicer to each other. And somewhere, carved into another stone pillar placed in another wind-swept outpost, another message appeared. "Let no one think lightly of goodness." The wind read it first, then the sparrows, then a merchant passing through who paused, nodded, and carried it with him. By the time Ashoka's reign entered its quiet middle chapters, the sort of years where nothing exploded but everything shifted, he had become less a man and more a presence. His name, once spoken with battlefield awe or courtly caution, now hung over markets and monasteries like incense. Soft, persistent, a little sticky. He still held court, yes, but not with the flair of his youth. Gone were the embroidered robes and dramatic pauses before decisions. He now wore simple garments, often slightly crumpled, and had the unfortunate habit of quoting sutras in the middle of tax reform meetings. One minister noted, with some dismay, that Ashoka once interrupted a treasury briefing to ask whether we collect coin or karma. The minister was not invited back. At this point, Ashoka's bureaucracy had swollen to match the empire's spiritual ambition. The Dharma Mahamitras, his moral officers, now numbered in the hundreds, their duties included everything from resolving neighborly disputes over goat noise to delivering sermons at crossroads, to ensuring that prisoners were being treated with adequate spiritual opportunities, and at least one window. Naturally, some of them took liberties. One Mahamudra, posted near the eastern forests, famously tried to ban shouting during monsoon season because it startled the trees. Another in the south translated every official edict into verse, resulting in one tax exemption notice being mistaken for a romantic confession. And in the north, a particularly enthusiastic officer developed a campaign titled Hug a Rival, which led to 3 near stabbings and 1 very awkward wedding. Ashoka, ever patient, adjusted. He expanded training for his Dharma agents. He set up administrative schools with courses like kindness and governance, the ethics of cattle disputes, and how to deliver a sermon without making it weird. Attendance was mandatory. The goat was once invited to give a guest lecture but declined, citing personal boundaries. Still, the emperor wasn't content with moral memos. He longed to reach his people more directly, and so came the great listening tours. Every year or so, Ashoka would leave the palace and travel through the provinces, not with an army, but with monks, scribes, and a truly alarming number of cooking pots. He'd stop in villages, sit under banyan trees, and listen to farmers, to weavers, to wandering ascetics who had opinions about everything and breath that could fell a yak. He asked about droughts and harvests. He asked if people felt at peace. He asked if the roads were smooth and the water sweet. And he took notes, actual, meticulous notes, which he later turned into policy proposals that baffled half the ministers and delighted the other half. One village near the mountains complained that the official tax collector recited poetry instead of giving receipts. The next season, all tax collectors were issued clay stamps and a copy of Don't Be Confusing, a manual for gentle bureaucracy. Now, historians still argue whether these tours were effective. Some say they were little more than performance. Others insist they were the reason the Mauryan bureaucracy outlasted Ashoka himself. What's undeniable is that people remembered them. Elders spoke of the day the emperor shared tea with them and asked about the village goat. Children pointed to the road where Ashoka's elephant caravan had stopped and left behind polished footprints. And perhaps that's the point. Ashoka had begun to rule not by distance or decree, but by presence, quiet, slow-moving, deeply interested presence. Of course, not all feedback was cheerful. In one town, a group of merchants complained that the new ethics-driven trade regulations had made it difficult to sell mildly fraudulent herbal remedies. Ashoka responded by inviting them to a palace symposium titled Truth in Commerce. Can soap be spiritual? It did not improve their sales, but the pamphlet was exquisite. Another time, a minor noble wrote a scathing letter accusing Ashoka of weakening the empire through excessive compassion. Ashoka thanked him, publicly posted the letter on a pillar, and added a commentary below in verse form. It became a popular reading during seasonal festivals. Still, even the emperor needed rest, and when he returned to Pataliputra, he did so with the gait of a man who'd walked across the known world, listened to every complaint, tried to fix most of them, and really just wanted a cup of tea and 10 minutes of uninterrupted goat watching. In the quiet evenings, he would sit in the palace garden beneath the glow of lanterns shaped like lotuses and reflect. He spoke less, wrote more, and his dreams, if the scribes are to be believed, were full of temples that didn't yet exist, roads that led nowhere, and people speaking in languages he hadn't yet heard, but somehow understood. One night, a servant found him standing barefoot in the courtyard rain, murmuring to a moth. No one asked why, and through all of this, the goat remained. Older now, grayer, slightly fatter, but still present, often sleeping near Ashoka's writing table, occasionally chewing the edge of a moral treatise, and always giving the impression that it understood far more than it let on. In fact, one of Ashoka's last inscriptions, rarely quoted, mentions a companion of silent wisdom, four-legged and fond of scrolls. Historians remain divided, but the point is this: Ashoka had changed the empire, not just with laws or wars or wealth, but with a kind of deliberate slowness, a sanded-down form of governance that replaced orders with questions, punishments with reflection, and where possible swords with sermons. And in doing so, he had created something fragile, something not everyone valued, in the corners of the empire, where Dharma hadn't quite settled. The winds of old ambition began to stir, and though Ashoka didn't say it aloud, he felt them like distant drums, muffled but persistent. The empire stretched like a contented beast beneath the sun, its tail brushing the Himalayas and its paws dipping into the seas. It looked peaceful pillars everywhere, trade humming along gently like a lullaby with coin-shaped notes. And even the tax collectors had started wearing softer shoes so as not to disturb meditation. But Ashoka knew better. Empires, like goats, never truly sit still. Even when they appear calm, they're usually planning something. In the far reaches, those sunburnt provinces where Dharma edicts arrived months late, and often with bite marks, old habits crept back. Small chieftains tested the edges of authority. Trade lords bartered with bribes instead of receipts. One ambitious governor tried to declare himself a spiritual co-emperor, which resulted in a very polite but very firm letter from the Bureau of Titles, subtitled "No." Ashoka responded not with troops, but with more Dharma. He commissioned new stone inscriptions, this time written in even simpler language and, where possible, illustrated with moral stories involving monkeys, clouds, and rice pots. He called them Conversations with Stone, a name which confused international observers and delighted the local children. The pillars themselves had become characters now. One near the Ganges had a local myth that it could sigh in the wind. Another in the western plains was said to glow faintly. When read at sunset, it didn't. But a clever trader sold talismans that said otherwise. And in the central hills, a particularly large edict became known as the Rock That Thinks, though this may have been due to a lichen pattern that resembled a disappointed eyebrow, and yet cracks were forming. Ashoka was aging. He still toured when he could, still listened with that deep, sun-drenched patience, but his footsteps were slower, his silences longer, and his appetite for lentils somewhat diminished. His scribes began referring to his moods as weather, and the palace goat, now fully retired and living on a cushion embroidered with tiny Bodhi leaves, seemed to bleat more cautiously when he passed. One day, during a visit to a temple in the northwest, Ashoka asked to be left alone. He sat beneath a fig tree, not unlike the famous one under which the Buddha attained enlightenment, and remained there for 3 days. He didn't eat. He barely drank. Monks worried. Ministers panicked. One ambitious cousin began measuring curtains for the throne room. But on the 4th day, Ashoka rose. His face was pale. His eyes, normally so calm, held the stormy gleam of a man who'd seen something vast, terrible, and unavoidable. He summoned his ministers and issued a new decree. No more conquest. Not of land, not of loyalty, not even of thought. From this moment forward, the empire would defend, preserve, nurture, but never expand. The ministers, as usual, wrote this down furiously, then rewrote it, in case it was metaphorical, then rewrote it again with annotations for the army, who responded with quiet throat-clearing and requests for clarification regarding minor regional scuffles. Ashoka, however, was done clarifying. He spoke now in slow, heavy phrases like a man trying to convince the future not to repeat him. He began distributing personal letters, not edicts, not royal orders, just letters to community leaders across the empire. In them, he asked questions, offered encouragement. Sometimes he simply thanked them for planting trees, or teaching ethics, or not yelling during festivals. These letters were often found years later, tucked into shrine walls or pressed into clay pots, bearing his personal seal and the unmistakable air of someone trying to hold a vast spinning wheel still with their hands. And then came the family. Ah, yes. The family, Ashoka, for all his spiritual wisdom, had not entirely mastered parenting. Mahinda and Sangamita were off in Lanka, still teaching, still inspiring, still responding to every letter with the formal flourish of philosophers who had learned to quote themselves, but his other children, those who had remained in the empire, were less enlightened. Some saw Dharma as an inconvenience. Others saw it as a throne warmer. At least one son believed that enlightenment could be achieved through enthusiastic horse racing, which Ashoka firmly disputed, especially after the stables were nearly burned down. The emperor tried. He hosted philosophical debates. He invited monks to dine with the royal family. He even wrote a short handbook titled On Being a Ruler Without Being Terrible, which no one read beyond chapter 3. His children nodded, smiled, quoted his own edicts back at him, and then proceeded to argue over inheritance like jackals in a grain cellar. Ashoka didn't blame them, not entirely. They had been raised in marble halls, wrapped in robes stitched by invisible hands, taught that their words would echo louder than most people's screams. But still, it disappointed him. He had built a moral empire. But would it endure? Historians still debate the answer. Some say yes, pointing to the monasteries, the continued spread of Buddhist thought, the enduring idea that a king could rule with softness. Others shake their heads and remind us how quickly power reverts to the sharp, the loud, and the violently persuasive. Ashoka, for his part, seemed to know. He didn't try to name a successor. He didn't draft a will filled with gold or threats. Instead, he began sending out his final set of edicts, not to everyone, just to those who had asked questions during his travels, to the woman who asked about justice, to the merchant who wept during a sermon, to the boy who gave up his mango to a stranger. Simple messages, personal truths, the soft echo of a man retreating from greatness into grace. And so the empire, still wrapped in silk and stone, held its breath, waiting, watching, listening to an emperor who had once ruled with steel and now ruled with silence. In the final decade of Ashoka's reign, the empire began to resemble its emperor, slower, more introspective, prone to pausing halfway through things to wonder what it all meant. Pataliputra, the once bustling, bell clanging, elephant jostling capital had grown quieter, not empty. No, just settled. The streets were still full, but the chaos had been replaced with a kind of gentle order. Tax collectors whispered, philosophers walked with their hands clasped behind their backs. Even the stray dogs had, over time, learned to look contemplative. And Ashoka, now gray and softened like a long-used cushion, moved through his palace with the air of a man trying not to disturb the dust. He was not bedridden. He still attended meetings, still reviewed reports, still scolded generals for being too excited about hypothetical wars. But he had begun to withdraw from spectacle. No more processions, no more speeches in public squares. His presence now felt more like a memory made flesh, drifting slowly through hallways, sometimes humming verses, sometimes simply listening. The goat, now ancient, by any measure, and possibly sustained by sheer imperial will, was often seen curled beside his chair, snoring through sermons, and once, audibly, farting during a council discussion on maritime law. No one dared comment. Ashoka had started to measure time differently, not in seasons or lunar cycles, but in questions asked and regrets softened. He kept notebooks, small clay tablets tucked into the folds of his robes. He would scratch down thoughts as they came to him. Have I done enough? Can a good life undo a violent youth? Does the Bodhi tree ever wonder if it's being watched too much? Ministers found them and worried. Were these notes instructions? Prophecies? Warnings? Ashoka laughed when told. No, he said once, handing a scribe a half-finished verse. They're just me trying to remember I existed. His court, meanwhile, had begun to plan. Succession meetings became more frequent. Alliances shifted like furniture before a surprise guest. One noble even tried to marry 3 potential heirs in the same month, claiming it was a ritual. It was not, and the goat bit him. Ashoka, predictably, didn't interfere. He watched it all unfold with the same expression one might give to a group of dancers performing a piece you'd choreographed years ago, but who had long since forgotten the original steps. Instead, he focused on smaller things. One day he spent 4 hours helping a novice monk reorganize the palace scrolls by moral theme. Another time, he wandered into the kitchens and made a flatbread so perfectly round the cook wept. He held long conversations with children, with birds, with visiting scholars who came expecting a grand audience and left with an old man's musings on why mango pits are shaped the way they are. And always, he carved. The edicts never stopped. They changed, yes, became less commanding, more uncertain. One of the last read simply, "Let even those who disagree walk beside us, if they wish." It was found on a pillar so remote it took a month to verify it wasn't just graffiti from an unusually philosophical shepherd. There were rumors of illness. His walks grew shorter. He stopped traveling. The garden became his world. Trees planted decades earlier now offered real shade. Birds returned to nests he had watched built twig by twig. Monks chanted softly nearby, not because he asked them to, but because they could sense he liked it. Once Sanghamitta returned from Lanka, old now herself. She brought no grand news, just a cup of seawater, and a list of new students learning the Dhamma under moonlight. They sat together in the garden, silent. She did not ask what would happen next. She knew. Ashoka, like any ruler who lives long enough to regret everything and still hope for something, had begun to fade with intention. He gave no final address. He issued no grand command. The throne passed awkwardly, noisily, to a grandson whose name no one remembers quite as well. What Ashoka left behind was not in palaces or treasure vaults, but in people, in a weaver who paused before swatting a moth, in a merchant who added a bench outside his shop for travelers too tired to bargain, in a goat-shaped figurine placed at a village shrine with the inscription, "He was kind," eventually, and in stones, so many stones, etched with hopes, with questions, with awkward grammar and fading lines, but still there, still waiting for someone to stop, read, and remember. Historians still argue, of course, was Ashoka a sincere convert or a clever manipulator? Was his transformation real or a performance? Did his policies weaken the empire or deepen it? The answer, as with most questions worth asking, is probably yes to all of the above. Ashoka was many things: warrior, emperor, father, failure, reformer, recluse. But above all, he was a man who tried. In a world that rewarded conquest, he reached late, fumbling, often, but reached nonetheless for compassion. And somehow, across centuries, that reaching still echoes. The empire, of course, didn't last, but the edicts did. And so, long after the throne was forgotten, long after the ministers had turned back into dust, and the goat into legend, the stones remained quiet, steady, still whispering. After Ashoka's death, quiet, candlelit, unceremonious in the grand scheme of empire, something peculiar happened. Nothing. At first, nothing. The empire did not collapse overnight. No barbarians at the gate. No thunderous rebellion. Just the shuffling of scrolls, the clearing of throats, the unmistakable sound of ministers reorganizing seating charts. The capital moved with the inertia of habit. Royal proclamations were still issued, though now they were more about tariffs than transcendence. Dharma Mahamatra still traveled, but more slowly and with noticeably less zeal. The goat's former cushion was quietly cleaned and reassigned to a noble with hip trouble. The throne, after some mild wrestling, passed to Kunala Ashoka's blind son in some versions, a sidelined mystic in others, or perhaps to Samprati, his grandson, who inherited the role like a man, given both a very large garden and a rake made entirely of philosophy. No one seemed quite sure who was supposed to be in charge. One scribe reportedly asked, "Do we still follow Dharma?" and was answered with a vague hand gesture that may have meant yes, maybe, or have you eaten? You see, Ashoka's absence was not marked by silence. It was marked by confusion. He had, over the years, so thoroughly embedded his personality into governance that once he was gone, the machinery of state sputtered like a temple bell struck by a fish. The new rulers tried. Oh, how they tried. They preserved the edicts. Some even carved their own. Though mostly about irrigation, a few attempted to emulate Ashoka's barefoot walks, only to be carried back by bodyguards after stepping on thorny metaphor. But the spark, that strange, still fire of someone who believed that power could be patient, was missing. The provinces noticed. In the north, small kings began behaving less like vassals and more like auditioning emperors. In the south, merchants quietly began setting their own tariffs. A governor in the west declared a festival of forgetting where no one mentioned taxes for a week. It was very popular. Ashoka's long experiment in moral statecraft had not failed, but it had depended perhaps too much on him, like a stew that only works when stirred by exactly the right spoon. Historians today shake their heads. He should have planned better, some say. He should have created structures that lasted. Others sigh in reply. You try building bureaucracy out of kindness and parables? The truth, of course, is that Ashoka had never really been interested in permanence. He wasn't building a fortress. He was scattering seeds. Some took root. In Sri Lanka, Buddhist tradition flourished. The sapling planted by Sanghamita grew into a sprawling, sacred tree visited by pilgrims with reverence and very sore feet. Monks recited the edicts. The sermons of Mahinda were copied by hand, with occasional doodles in the margins of elephants looking pensive. Further afield, ideas carried by Ashoka's envoys mingled with local beliefs. In places where no one remembered his name, people still remembered the shape of his hopes. Stories of kings who chose peace, laws that asked questions, empires that apologized. Even today, in dusty museums and roadside ruins, you can find one of his pillars, still standing, still whispering. Back in India, however, the Mauryan Empire began to crack, slowly, politely, like a grand old inn that simply stops replacing its roof tiles. Governors stopped sending reports, armies stopped marching. The capital lost its rhythm. One day, a royal falconer released a message bird, and it never came back. Not because it was intercepted, but because it had no idea where to go. It was last seen perched atop an Ashokan pillar, looking deeply uncertain, and still. The edict stood stone. Of course, doesn't govern. It doesn't collect taxes, stop rebellions, or plan crop rotations, but it endures, it outlasts. There's something quietly beautiful about that, because while the empire fell, and it did, within a few decades, swallowed by the push and pull of regional powers, the words stayed. They stayed in temples, in translations, in travelers' tales. They stayed in monks who crossed mountains carrying nothing but robes and memory. They stayed in stone. And that, perhaps, was the point. Ashoka hadn't been trying to make his empire last. He was trying to make gentleness last. And that sort of thing doesn't come with a throne. It comes with a child in a village reading a story about a king who cried after a battle. It comes with a tired merchant choosing to forgive a debt because he remembers a sermon he once overheard in a rainstorm. It comes with a traveler sitting beside a cracked pillar, tracing faded script with his fingers and wondering who would bother writing. Be kind to prisoners in stone. The successors, whoever they were, ruled as best they could, some with cruelty, some with boredom, some with wild optimism and very little sleep. Their names are footnotes now, but Ashoka remains, not as a man, but as a question. Can power be kind? It is a question we still haven't answered. And so the goats graze, the stones wait, and somewhere in a quiet archive where the dust smells faintly of ink and old sandalwood, a scroll is opened to reveal a single line. All men are my children. And a tired scribe, not knowing what else to do, underlines it by now. Dear listener, if your eyelids are still fluttering bravely against the pull of sleep, you may be wondering what happened to all those monks, ministers, and minor nobles left adrift in Ashoka's absence. The answer, mostly, is paperwork. Yes, the grand legacy of Ashoka the Great was not just compassion or stone edicts or the slightly unnerving ability to quote 5 moral maxims while staring at you with silent disappointment. It was forms, registers, reports filed in triplicate, entire hills of palm leaf documents attesting to tree plantings, sermon summaries, and arguments about who moved whose boundary stone by 3 paces and why that obviously required a 5-hour mediation. You see, Ashoka's bureaucratic machinery, built in the shadow of his philosophical transformation, continued chugging long after the fuel of his personality had burned out. And in some strange way, that was a triumph in itself, because empires usually decay into chaos or calcify into cruelty. But the Mauryan Empire, for a little while at least, simply softened. In provinces once prone to rebellion, Dharma Mahamitra still conducted public readings. In village schools, ethics remained part of the curriculum, alongside more practical skills like irrigation mathematics and how not to anger the provincial inspector. A few regional rulers even declared local versions of Dharma festivals, some involving lanterns, others mango-eating contests judged by elderly monks. Now, were these officials always sincere? Certainly not. There were reports, so many reports of minor governors using Ashokan edicts as coasters. One famously reinterpreted respect for all religions to mean he could build 6 temples in his own honor, each shaped like a different animal, another band arguing entirely during monsoon season because he claimed that the rain makes everyone too dramatic. But the presence of Dharma, even diluted, even mangled by well-meaning fools and ambitious goat breeders, remained oddly sturdy. One reason for this was that Ashoka had not only spoken to the people he had written to the earth. His pillars and rocks weren't tucked inside palaces or private libraries. They stood by rivers, near crossroads, next to wells. They became part of the landscape. Villagers gave directions using them. Turn left at the stone that says, "Don't insult your neighbors." Children scratched their names on them. Pilgrims left flowers. Once, a particularly sleepy farmer leaned against a pillar and claimed to have dreamt. The Buddha whispered, "Water your crops sooner." Ashoka's words, chiseled deep, were not just rules. They were reminders, soft echoes of a man who tried to turn regret into public service. But let's not pretend all was enlightenment and lotus blossoms. The empire, after all, was still enormous, and empires are hungry things. As trade expanded and border tensions returned, old instincts began to creep in. New administrators, born after Ashoka's passing, began to view Dharma not as a guiding principle, but as a quaint footnote. A few even suggested removing the more impractical edicts and replacing them with updated codes, less kindness, more compliance. One proposal involved chiseling over the phrase, "All faiths are worthy of respect," with "pay your taxes on time." It was not approved, but the stonemasons were asked for a quote, just in case. Some monks resisted, others adapted. A famous elder in the West, called Mahadeva, the sleepy for reasons that need no further explanation, began delivering sermons that blended Dharma with agricultural advice, declaring that compassion is like compost, uncomfortable at first, but nourishing in time. Meanwhile, in the South, a novice monk became briefly famous for preaching to goats. He claimed they listened better than humans. No one disagreed. Still, there were efforts to protect the legacy. Scribes continued transcribing Ashoka's edicts into portable scripts. These texts spread to monasteries, libraries, and curious royal courts beyond the empire's reach. Ashoka's vision fragmented, though it survived not through bloodlines, but ink lines. In one case, a scroll bearing his edict about justice and mercy was found centuries later, wedged into the roof of a collapsing village hut. Its edges were nibbled by mice. Its words, barely legible, still read, "Let none cause suffering to any living creature." And the empire, well, eventually, the Mauryan dynasty ended not with an explosion, but with a whimper. The throne passed from cousin to cousin. Like a festival mask no one quite knew how to wear anymore. The center weakened. Borders frayed. Local kings remembered how much they liked having opinions, but the fall was slow. It wasn't chaos, it was compost. One empire returning to the soil so that others might grow. And grow they did. New kingdoms rose. Some remembered Ashoka fondly, others not at all. But here and there, his influence popped up like herbs in forgotten gardens. A law favoring prisoner rights, a festival focused on inner peace, a story, half remembered, of a king who once refused to conquer. Again, after seeing what conquest cost. Even now, in distant corners of the world, tourists stumble upon cracked stone pillars and ask their guides, "What's this?" And the guides, if they're kind, or tired, or curious themselves, will say, "Ah, yes, Emperor Ashoka, he ruled with kindness." Mostly, and that, perhaps, is the most Ashokan legacy of all. Not perfect memory, but durable myth. Not eternal power, but the echo of an intention. A goat, a monk, a stone, a question. Can a king rule with gentleness and still be remembered? Look around. The stones are still standing. As the years folded onward, like slightly overhandled parchment, the name Ashoka slowly drifted out of royal archives and into rumor, not gone, never truly gone, but repurposed. Less a figure of flesh and history, more a character in parables told after third bowls of rice by monks with mild speech impediments and excellent timing. He once made peace with a river. One tale begins, taught it not to flood by apologizing to it. Never mind that this likely confused several generations of engineers. The story persisted. In northern hills, he was remembered as the emperor who could speak to birds. In coastal villages, they said he tamed pirates with a single sermon about karma and fish. In one peculiar account from the western frontier, Ashoka is credited with convincing a thunderstorm to reroot itself, though that tale also involves a talking tree and a bottle of fermented lentil wine. So scholars remain skeptical. What's important isn't whether these stories are true. What's important is that they were useful. In times of trouble, village elders would gesture vaguely toward a cracked pillar or a moldy scroll and say, "Remember Ashoka, he ruled with patience." And for a moment, at least, people would pause before yelling at each other about goats trampling fence lines. And though the Mauryan dynasty was now firmly past tense, something of its rhythm lingered. Stone carvers still copied his script for practice. Philosophers still argued about whether Dharma could be legislated. And monks, those tireless hoarders of footnotes and half-finished thoughts, continued to copy Ashoka's edicts into collections with titles like A Short Guide to Not Being Terrible and Ruling as If Other People Matter. One monk, writing in the margins of a crumbling text, noted, "This emperor tried to make the world gentle. He was not always successful, but oh, he tried." And really, that was it, because Ashoka's reign, for all its wars and wonders, was remembered not for what it achieved, but for what it attempted. He had tried. He had tried to stop conquering. He had tried to make laws kinder. He had tried to feed the poor, educate the confused, comfort the dying, and convince bickering ministers to lower their voices while debating regional grain quotas. That last bit never worked, but still, he tried. And when later kings rose, some brilliant, some blustering, some with eyebrows more impressive than their policies, Ashoka remained in the background. A ghost not of vengeance or power, but of possibility. He haunted maps more than thrones, and sometimes, unexpectedly, he reappeared. In the Gupta period, a curious scholar found one of Ashoka's edicts and declared, so ruling doesn't have to involve shouting." He was ignored, but he wrote a very popular pamphlet anyway. Centuries later, in a dusty Buddhist temple nestled between two trading routes and a stubborn patch of bamboo, a monk copying a half-burned scroll looked up and asked aloud, "Why don't they teach more about Ashoka?" The silence that followed was not accusatory, just tired. You see, history often forgets the quiet ones, the ones who choose not to conquer, the ones who trade thrones for questions, the ones who plant trees they'll never sit beneath. Ashoka planted many, literal trees, shade givers, fruit bearers, branches outstretched like the arms of old men offering advice, and metaphorical ones, ideas whose roots reached deeper than his empire ever stretched. But the world kept moving. Trade shifted. Armies rose. New faiths flourished. The pillars wore down, their inscriptions rubbed thin by wind, rain, and the occasional overzealous goat scratching its back. And then, for a while, Ashoka vanished entirely. A gap, a silence in the record. No festivals, no footnotes, no mentions in political debates. Just a name that sounded vaguely familiar to the few who still cleaned old stones for offerings or chased curious tourists away from sacred ruins with sticks and moral superiority, until one day, in the 19th century, quite a bit later than our tale had been meandering through, a British archaeologist tripped over a fragment of stone while looking for something else. It had words on it, not English, not Latin, not even the Sanskrit he expected. Prakrit, ancient, local, beautifully stubborn. And beside it, a symbol, the Dharma wheel. "What's this?" the archaeologist asked, and thus began the rediscovery of Ashoka, in a twist so delightfully ironic it might have made the old emperor chuckle into his lentils. The man who had once tried to erase his violent past beneath layers of dharma and reflection was now being reassembled, stone by stone, inscription by people entirely unaware of how complicated he'd been. His edicts were translated, cataloged, displayed in glass cases with titles like Edict No, 3, on not slaughtering things if you can help it. Scholars debated tone, clerks debated punctuation, somewhere, a committee was formed to determine whether Ashoka's personal seal had originally been a lion or an unusually proud squirrel. And slowly, quietly, his memory returned. Not in the way of conquerors, no blazing statues or booming chants, but in books, classrooms, whispered retellings by teachers who'd grown tired of teaching only about wars. He became a case study, a curiosity, a contradiction worth discussing. And in that, Ashoka became again what he perhaps had always been, a question. What if an emperor ruled not to be feared, but to be forgiven? As Ashoka's name crept back into the world, scholars dusted him off like a long-lost recipe. 1 part king, 2 parts monk, a dash of contradiction, stirred gently with regret and left to simmer beneath a Bodhi tree. And like any good historical rediscovery, everyone immediately disagreed about what it meant. Some called him a visionary, the first ruler in recorded history to embrace nonviolence as state policy. Others, somewhat less impressed, described him as a cautionary tale, proof that a peaceful empire is a short-lived one, especially when your successors are better at chess than governing. A few, in well-lit university halls, leaned forward solemnly and asked, "But was he genuine?" To which a tiny voice in the back, possibly a goat, might have replied, "Does it matter? Because here's the thing about Ashoka. He didn't erase his past. He carried it, tiredly, like an overly embroidered cloak that didn't quite fit anymore, but which he refused to throw away. Take, for instance, Edict the 30, the most famous of them all. There, Ashoka describes the conquest of Kalinga, not with triumph, but with shame. He writes of the slaughter, the despair, the 100,000 who died, not to boast, but to repent in stone, publicly, permanently. Imagine a modern ruler carving "sorry about the war" into every freeway overpass. Historians have never quite known what to do with this. Was it political, performative, a brilliant attempt to unify a traumatized empire under a banner of guilt-washed virtue? Or did he truly mean it, this blood-soaked king, kneeling beside the wreckage of Kalinga, blinking through smoke and asking the universe, "What now?" We'll never know. But that's the gift of Ashoka. Really? He doesn't offer answers. He invites discomfort. He's a lesson with muddy feet, a sermon that starts with a sword, a king who tried to be better, in full view of everyone who remembered why he needed to. And that, dear listener, is rare because most emperors want you to forget their failures. Ashoka carved his into stone and then spent the rest of his life trying to write better chapters beside them. His image, as it re-emerged in modern India, was embraced with surprising warmth. In 1950, when India became a republic, it chose Ashoka's lion capital, yes. The very sculpture perched atop one of his surviving pillars as the national emblem. His Dharma wheel spins proudly at the center of the flag. An empire once lost in time now stands, at least symbolically, at the very heart of a modern democracy. And what does that say? Perhaps that kindness, slow, flawed, occasionally bureaucratic kindness is worth remembering, even if it fails, especially if it fails. For Ashoka didn't succeed in the way we usually mean. His successors unraveled the empire. The borders shrank. The officials forgot their scripts. One province declared independence because someone insulted their temple's soup. But still, he mattered, because long after the palaces fell, the pillars stood, and long after the pillars weathered, the words remained. You can find them now translated into 100 languages, quoted by politicians and school children and earnest YouTubers with soft background music and too many candle emojis. And while most won't remember the finer points of his land reforms or that particularly enthusiastic goat, they'll remember this. He changed. He was terrible, then thoughtful, then tired, then perhaps wise. That arc, that imperfect arc, is what gives Ashoka his gravity. not because he was born noble, but because he tried to become it. Now, if you go to the museum in Sarnath and stand before one of his pillars, you'll notice something curious. Not the lions majestic as they are or the chiseled script, but the space around it. It's quiet. People lower their voices. They pause, not because the stone demands it, but because it carries the weight of something unspoken, a sense that here stood someone who could have ruled like the others and didn't. In that stillness, if you listen closely, you might even hear the echo of Ashoka's most private question. Can I be forgiven by the world I once broke? And somewhere, perhaps in the rustle of trees he planted or in the soft exhale of a monk finishing a morning chant, the world answers not with a yes or no, but with a quieter, slower truth. You are remembered, and that, in the end, may be more than most kings ever get. In the years that followed Ashoka's rediscovery, his memory became a sort of gentle revolution, one made not with flags or armies, but with syllables and questions. He entered textbooks, not as a war hero, but as something far more disruptive, a thoughtful man in power. It unsettled people. This idea, especially those who had long equated strength with conquest. How do you explain to a classroom full of students, fed on tales of empires built by sword and siege, that one of the most powerful emperors in history ended his reign trying to teach compassion to civil servants? It didn't fit. And that, of course, was the point. Ashoka was never meant to fit. He was the awkward afterthought in the chronicles of grand strategy, the emperor who chose to write about morality instead of military formations, who asked his people not to fear him, but to listen, and then wildly to question him back. In some of his later edicts, Ashoka even urged his officials to admit when they were wrong. Let there be tolerance, he wrote, and humility. It was not exactly standard policy at the time. Modern scholars, bless them, have tried to classify him, a proto-humanitarian. Some say a benevolent autocrat. Others sigh and label him a historical anomaly, as if that explains anything. But step outside the libraries and into the villages where his pillars still lean gently in the weeds, and you'll hear something else. Children playing nearby call the stones the talking rocks. Old women leave flower petals at their base, not because they remember what the inscriptions say, but because their grandmothers did. Local guides sometimes add their own interpretations to the messages. Be kind to strangers. They might say, but don't lend them your goat. The message has survived not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. Ashoka's dharma wasn't clean. It was messy, uneven, sometimes contradictory. He built hospitals and still allowed capital punishment. He banned certain animal sacrifices, but likely still sanctioned warfare when diplomacy failed. He preached tolerance while trying to regulate morality. But through it all, he kept trying. One gets the impression, reading between the etched lines of his edicts, that Ashoka wasn't offering solutions. He was narrating his own internal struggle out loud, in public, in granite, as if to say, I'm figuring this out too. And in doing so, he gave permission for everyone else to do the same. That may be the strangest part of his legacy. Because while other kings built temples to themselves, Ashoka built reminders to doubt himself. He wanted his people not just to obey, but to reflect. He didn't say, do as I command. He said, this is what I've learned, what do you think? It was revolutionary. In the quietest, most profoundly inconvenient way. It also made him deeply unpopular with some of his descendants. We know this because within a generation or two of his death, some of his reforms were rolled back. The moral officers were reassigned. The public sermons silenced. A few of the pillars were even deliberately defaced, scratched out by impatient hands who clearly preferred clearer rules and fewer questions. One successor, when confronted with Ashoka's legacy, is said to have grumbled. He ruled like a monk and left me with monks. This quote, though apocryphal, is almost certainly accurate, but others clung to the vision. In quiet temples and dusty monasteries, scribes copied his words by candlelight. Teachers used his life as a moral example, not of sainthood, but of possibility, of what a person flawed, powerful, burdened might still choose to become. And still the stories grew. Ashoka the emperor, Ashoka the gentle, Ashoka the regretful, Ashoka who cried after victory, Ashoka who sent messages on boats and scrolls and the backs of tired traders, Ashoka who believed that being kind, even late, was still worth doing. Now, in the modern world, so full of noise and speed, it might be easy to miss just how radical that is. A leader who says, "I was wrong." A conqueror who lays down his weapons, not because he was defeated, but because he understood. And somewhere across the curve of time, you begin to feel it, that slow, stubborn rhythm of Ashoka's heart, still beating beneath layers of stone and story. It's in the pause between arguments, in the stranger who shares their seat, in the whispered reminder, lead, yes, but gently. Even now, governments quote him, scholars debate him, and tired innkeepers ones, with scrolls stained by stew and dreams full of bickering goats, still tell his story before sleep. And why not? It is, after all, a very boring kind of greatness. No dragons, no chariots of fire, no last stands on windy cliffs. Just a man who once won everything and chose to stop. Ashoka's story, now well past the age of incense and parchment, began drifting once more, not downward into forgetfulness, but outward like smoke from an old fire, curling through time, leaving behind the scent of something both burnt and beautiful. In universities, his name became a footnote in moral philosophy classes. In temples, a symbol of worldly power, laid humbly at the feet of higher truths. In dusty museums with oddly shaped audio guides, he became a statue stoic, serene, and surrounded by tourists whispering, wasn't he the one who? Yes, he was the one who. But here's where it gets truly strange. While Ashoka faded from politics and pageantry, he began to reappear in places he likely never imagined. In the 20th century, as India pushed toward independence, leaders began seeking a legacy not of conquerors or colonial governors, but of their own something or someone who could remind a fragmented country that its moral heart had not always been silent. Ashoka returned. They found him again not as a dusty relic, but as a whisper of possibility, a native king who had ruled with empathy, embraced pluralism, and written laws with the intention of making people better, not just more obedient. He became the past that the future needed, his Dharma wheel. The Ashoka chakra was placed at the center of India's national flag, not as a decoration, but as a promise, a reminder that progress is not always a race forward, but sometimes a return to gentleness, to justice, to the spiral path inward. And so the man who had once wept on a battlefield came to stand at the heart of a new republic, arms metaphorically wrapped around every citizen, whispering, try to do better, even if it's late. Now, of course, not everyone agreed on what to do with Ashoka. Some politicians admired his clarity. Others cherry-picked his principles like fruit from a very old tree. A few critics, naturally, rolled their eyes and said, he was just a ruler like any other. But they missed something. Ashoka was never the only kind of ruler. He was the other kind, the one who admits he caused harm, who spends the second half of his life trying to listen instead of lecture, who puts down the sword not because he's too old to lift it, but because he finally understands its weight. In a world that often mistakes volume for truth and sharpness for strength, Ashoka remains an anomaly, a soft answer in a loud room, A man who, having held absolute power, said, "Let's make sure no one else suffers like this again." And how rare is that? Now, if you were to visit one of his pillars, say, the one in Sanchi, where the lions still gaze outward with a sort of eternal, slightly disappointed majesty, you might not understand the inscription right away. The script is old, the letters worn, the birds nest in the grooves, and the nearby snack vendor insists you try his cumin puffs before reading anything. But if you pause, really pause, and let the moment settle, you might notice something stranger still. You've seen this before. Not the stone, not the setting, but the idea. It's in the small act of kindness that no one applauds, in the official who chooses mercy over protocol, in the teacher who explains again, gently, when they could have scolded. It's the ghost of a man who tried once, loudly with war, and then quietly with love. And love, as Ashoka discovered, is not a battlefield. It's a bureaucracy. It's patience, policy, and repetition. It's telling your people, "You are my children," and then acting like it even when they're difficult, ungrateful, or suspicious of your new vegetarian budget. It's planting a tree by the roadside so that someone you'll never meet has shade. It's carving truth into stone and trusting the wind to carry it forward. Historians still don't know where Ashoka was buried. There are theories, a scattering of legends, a few contested graves, one suspiciously large urn with suspiciously little explanation. But maybe that's right. Maybe the man who spent his life stepping away from grandeur didn't need a tomb. Maybe he became a road, not the paved kind, but the inward kind, the one that turns conquerors into listeners, scribes into seekers, and bedtime listeners into quiet thinkers, wondering, just before sleep, what would I have done? Standing on that battlefield, would I have stopped? Would I have changed? Ashoka did, eventually, and that, for once, is more than enough. There's a certain slowness to the way legacy travels, not with trumpets or triumphs, but with tired feet and borrowed metaphors, wandering from one generation to the next, like a monk looking for shelter just before dusk. Ashoka's legacy did not gallop across history. It trudged, respectfully, sandal-clad, and perhaps that's why it lasted. You see, the stories about Ashoka didn't rely on miracles. No divine births, no flaming chariots, no riddles posed to the moon. Just a man who once had too much power and decided to do something slightly less terrible with it. This, historians agree, is a rare plotline. More often, the arc bends in the other direction. Peaceful beginnings that curdle into ambition. Quiet rulers who become thundering despots. But Ashoka inverted the script. He started as a blade and ended as a question mark. Take, for example, the way later rulers tried to emulate him. They rarely succeeded, not because his policies were impossible, though the goat-based civil service reforms never caught on, but because his path required something they didn't have, a willingness to be embarrassed by their former selves. Ashoka's greatness lay not in his conquest, nor even in his renunciation, but in his transparency. He didn't hide the war. He wrote about it, publicly, with numbers. With grief, he named the dead, described the cost, declared, in front of everyone who still remembered him at his worst, "I was wrong." And how many rulers do that? Even today, it's more common to rewrite the story, redirect the blame, or rename the disaster something like Operation Enlightened Disruption. But Ashoka, he looked at the ruins of Kalinga, then at his own reflection, and said, "This isn't who I want to be." He didn't stop being emperor. He just stopped pretending that being emperor made him wise. Now, centuries after his reign, some try to simplify him, to turn him into a tidy moral figure, the good king, the Buddhist benefactor, the stone edict guy. But that does a disservice to the messiness that made him remarkable. Ashoka wasn't always kind. He wasn't always right. He wasn't always humble. but he let those truths walk beside him. In one of his lesser-known edicts, found half-cracked beside a dry riverbed, he wrote, "Progress in Dharma is slow." It was not a boast. It was a warning. He knew that becoming good is not the same as being good. That kindness, like governance, is a discipline, a practice, a thing you do on days when you don't feel like doing it. Ashoka's reforms, in the end, were less about transformation than maintenance. He wasn't building heaven. He was fixing the gutters, teaching the empire to sit with its own restlessness, to make space for disagreement, to choose not once, but repeatedly not to retaliate. And if that sounds boring, well, yes, it is, but it's the kind of boring that saves lives, that stops cycles, that lets children grow up with fewer songs about glory and more songs about generosity. And when those children asked, who started this, someone could point to a weather-worn pillar and say, he did. Because he finally understood that being feared wasn't the same as being respected. Ashoka had enemies, of course. Even during his reign, there were those who rolled their eyes at the sermons, who whispered behind tapestries about weakness and softness and the good old days when kings smote more frequently. They complained that Dharma made governance feel like a classroom, that the edicts were too preachy, that the goat got more attention than the provincial tax office. But Ashoka wasn't trying to impress them. He was speaking to someone else, to the lonely merchant wondering if kindness costs too much, to the bored guard debating whether to shout or listen, to the tired mother wondering if anyone notices how she teaches patience. In a world full of noise, Ashoka didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to prove that power didn't have to destroy what it touched. And so he left his words behind, not on scrolls that rot, but on stone, on roadsides, in the open air, where anyone, centuries later, could lean close, squint at the script, and find themselves thinking, he really meant it, didn't he? Yes, he did. And yet, even with all his sincerity, all his carved stone, all his slow and deliberate attempts to turn an empire into a sermon, Ashoka knew that memory was fickle. He had watched history be rewritten in his own lifetime. He had seen ministers change stories mid-sentence, scribes clarify old declarations, and generals conveniently forget treaties they had toasted only weeks before. He had once joked, or perhaps not, that truth travels slower than a rumor tied to a horse, so he didn't try to preserve his image. He preserved his voice. Not in portraits, there are none. Not in statues, those came later. But in language, across the empire, he had the edicts inscribed in the dialects of the people. Not in high Sanskrit, spoken by scholars and courtiers, but in Prakrit, Aramaic, Greek languages of villagers, traders, herders, and traveling fools. Imagine that, an emperor choosing to address the common man on his terms. It's not flashy, it's not poetic, but it's intimate, intentional, human. One edict discovered in Afghanistan includes a message to the local Greek-speaking population. I have made arrangements that they may learn what is proper, not threatening, not self-glorifying, just instructive, almost fatherly. And this, perhaps, is the odd miracle of Ashoka. He ruled millions, yet somehow he spoke to you as if you were the only one listening. There are records, only fragments, really, of people reacting to these stones, travelers mentioning them in passing, local chieftains quoting them during festivals, a potter in the southern provinces who, according to legend, made a habit of pressing his forehead against a nearby pillar before opening his kiln. It wasn't worship, it was recognition. Ashoka's words reminded people that they mattered, that their actions were seen, that even the most powerful man in the land cared, however imperfectly, about what happened to them. And so the words stayed, not because of fear, but because they felt familiar, grounded, a reminder that morality wasn't just for temples or debates, but for markets, crossroads, courtyards, and goats who wandered too close to the tax records. But if Ashoka's voice endured, his structure did not. The empire, as we've said, unraveled slowly. There was no grand sacking of the capital, no villainous usurper with dramatic lighting and a flair for betrayal. Just decay, a provincial minister declaring autonomy, a tax officer forgetting to send reports, a region once loyal to the crown that realized, quietly, that the crown wasn't watching anymore. Ashoka's successors tried. Some even ruled well, but none with his vision, none with that weary, weathered clarity that only comes from having once ruined things and then spent the rest of your life trying not to do it again. And so the Mauryan Empire became legend, then memory, then silence. The pillars, of course, stayed, but they no longer spoke to power. They spoke to dust, to wine, to travelers who used them to tie up their donkeys and sometimes asked, "Who carved this?" while chewing on rice cakes and squinting into the sun. And yet even in their silence they taught that governance could be gentle, that regret could be public, that a man who'd once been feared could choose instead to be useful. If you ever visit the remains of Ashoka's world, and you can, though the bus schedules are unreliable and the goats are assertive, you'll find more than ruins. You'll find spaces, empty ones, where trees were planted, where wells were dug, where benches once stood, placed there not because they made sense financially, but because someone somewhere might need to sit. Ashoka understood the power of those spaces, the in-between moments. He didn't just build, he cleared room for thought, for change, for late-blooming forgiveness. And in that, he remains a rarity, not just a man who wielded power, but one who wondered what it was for. And if you're still awake, curled into a quiet corner of the night, listening to this story, drift through your thoughts like the last sigh of incense. Perhaps you feel it too, that echo of a question, carved into stone and shadow. Is it too late to be good? Ashoka didn't think so, and neither should you. If history were fair, the world would be full of monuments to hesitation statues, not of men on horses, but of those who paused, considered, and chose not to strike. There would be entire museums dedicated to changed minds, amended decrees, and the surprisingly heroic act of saying, "No, not this time." Ashoka would be in all of them. But history is a noisy place, and Ashoka's quiet brand of courage doesn't shout. It hums, it lingers, it settles into the bones of places, waiting to be rediscovered by people tired of noise. And so we find him not at the center of imperial fanfare, but off to the side, in the well-worn grooves of a stone pillar, near a village that no longer remembers what it once resisted, in the rhythm of Buddhist monks who still chant in languages Ashoka helped preserve, in the national symbol of India, those lions, proud and watchful, whose base once bore his words. And yet, even now, we try to summarize him too easily. A peaceful king, we say, but he wasn't born that way. He became, and the becoming that's slow, muddy, error-filled, noble attempt is the most human thing about him. He lived long enough to see the damage he caused. He ruled long enough to regret it. And he was brave enough to let that regret change him. He didn't just write apologies. He rewrote systems. He restructured power around restraint. He poured governance through the sieve of Dharma and made mercy not an exception. But the policy, not always, not perfectly, but more than most ever dared. And that's what made him dangerous, not to his enemies, but to the idea that cruelty is the natural companion of strength. Ashoka proved otherwise. And then, being Ashoka, he didn't boast. He carved it into roadside stones and left it there, waiting, perhaps hoping, one edict, rarely quoted and partially eroded by centuries of rain and bird droppings, ends with a line scholars still argue over. Translations vary, But the essence is this: let future kings remember ruling is not the same as owning. It's not a grand revelation. It's a sigh, the kind you release when you've spent years untangling the mess of your own authority, and finally realize that the crown fits best when it's worn with caution. Ashoka had come to understand that the empire did not belong to him. It never had. It belonged to the people who walked its roads, drank from its wells, whispered beneath its trees. His job, his calling, perhaps was to serve it, to improve it, or, at the very least, to stop hurting it. In the years after his death, that idea struggled. Governments like clarity. Dharma does not provide it. It offers tension, choice, the burden of knowing that being right isn't enough unless you are kind. But even when the bureaucracy forgot, the stones remembered. One by one, they've been uncovered, translated, debated, each one a small earthquake in the minds of those who thought ancient power was only ever brutal. Each one a reminder that a throne can also be a place to kneel. Even now, school children in India learn his name. Pilgrims visit Bodh Gaya, where Ashoka helped erect a temple near the Bodhi tree. Tourists photograph the lion capital without knowing its full weight. Historians still publish papers with footnotes longer than the edicts themselves. And still, the question remains, was it enough? Did Ashoka redeem himself? Could anyone? The answer, of course, is the same answer Ashoka left us in his final years. I tried, and perhaps that's the only answer that matters, because in a world that often celebrates decisive action, Ashoka celebrated deliberate action. He showed us that a ruler could be brave, not by dominating others, but by facing himself. That one could lose a battle and gain a soul. That power, when wielded slowly, tenderly, uncertainly, might actually be more powerful than force. And in that slow unfolding, in those weathered stones and long pauses between proclamations, we're left with a portrait not of a hero, but of a human, a man who saw what he had done, who heard the crying, who stopped and chose to change. He could have erased it. He didn't. He carved it instead. The end of Ashoka's life, like the rest of it, did not arrive with drama. There were no betrayals in the night, no deathbed speeches attended by tearful heirs, no flaming pyres surrounded by solemn ministers holding symbolic mangoes. No, Ashoka passed as he lived his latter years gently, slowly, with a kind of bureaucratic dignity. One scroll, barely preserved in the archives of a temple that later became a granary, notes that in his final days, Ashoka spent most of his time sitting not in meetings or councils, but simply sitting under trees, beside wells, near old stones, and occasionally in the wrong room entirely. Servants learned to bring him tea wherever he was, and monks began leaving cushions at random places around the palace, just in case. He said little. When he did speak, it was usually to ask questions. What is it the birds are discussing? Do you think the river still remembers the storm? Has the goat forgiven me for making it wear the ceremonial necklace? No one had answers, but that didn't seem to bother him. He smiled more, not out of contentment, but out of surrender, the gentle, world-worn smile of a man who had finally accepted that most of life is unfixable, but still worth tending to. There was no official declaration of death, no tolling of bells. His passing was noticed when he failed to show up to the Dharma Mahamatra's annual moral audit, something he had never missed in over 3 decades. A search was conducted. He was found under a Bodhi tree in the palace garden, seated, eyes closed, a half-written verse beside him, the ink still damp. It read, "Let even the smallest kindness outweigh the heaviest crown." And then the ink smudged. His death did not cause panic. The empire, already fraying at the edges, did not collapse in grief. The ministers met, debated succession, argued about which relatives were most problematic, and eventually selected someone no one quite remembers who. With a name that required multiple syllable rehearsals, Ashoka was buried. Perhaps, or cremated, or, as some believe, divided, his ashes distributed across the realm in small reliquaries, meant to carry peace like a scent, faint but persistent. The goat, now mythic, reportedly vanished that same week. Some say it wandered into the forest. Others claim it still haunts certain libraries, chewing the corners of scrolls that take themselves too seriously. And the pillars remained, all of them, dozens, scattered across the subcontinent, still bearing the grooves of Ashoka's words, still quietly offering advice to a world that rarely listens but occasionally remembers. They are not ornate, they are not flashy. They do not sing praises of conquest or divine right or family lineage. They simply say, be kind, be honest, resist cruelty, honor all paths. They speak to everyone, not as citizens, or subjects, or believers, but as humans. Even now, if you were to lean your head against one cool stone, against cheek, breeze tickling your ears, you might hear it whisper, try again tomorrow. Because that, in the end, is Ashoka's real gift, not redemption, not empire, not reform, but permission to change, to fail, to return, to rule less with fear and more with questions. To be remembered not for being right, but for trying and for keeping the door open for those who will try next. And now, as the last embers of this long tale dim into soft ash, let's sit here a while longer. The room is quiet now. The stories have been told, the scrolls rolled up, the cups emptied, the ink pots closed. A breeze drifts in through the window, smelling faintly of sandalwood and old parchment. The goat has found a warm corner to sleep in. Outside, the trees planted under Ashoka's reign still sway. The wells are full. The birds are murmuring nonsense in the dark, as they always have. A candle flickers. A page turns itself. Somewhere far away, a temple bell sounds not loud, just enough to remind the air it still exists. Ashoka is gone, but his gentleness remains in the worn places, the shaded paths, the pause before reply. So close your eyes now. Let the past rest. Let your breath slow, like the tide returning. You've wandered far enough for one night. Everything's quiet now. You're safe. Let the rest take you.